Two impoverished brothers inherit a deserted farm everyone else considers worthless. While repairing the collapsing barn, they strike something hard beneath the floorboards and uncover a hidden gold vein running under the property. Their accidental discovery transforms not only their fortunes, but also draws the attention of dangerous opportunists, forcing the brothers to protect their newfound legacy and each other. What starts as simple farm repairs becomes a test of brotherhood when greed and violence threaten everything they've worked to build together. But will their newfound wealth bring them closer together or tear them apart when outsiders discover their secret? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana landscape stretched endlessly under a pewter sky, rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional weathered fence post. A battered pickup truck, its blue paint faded to the color of old denim, crawled along the winding asphalt road. The engine coughed like an old man clearing his throat. But it kept moving forward with stubborn determination. Jacob Morrison gripped the steering wheel with calloused hands, his weathered face showing the kind of lines that came from squinting into sun and wind for most of his adult life. His flannel shirt was clean but worn thin at the elbows, and his work boots showed the honest scuffs of a man who earned his living with his hands. Beside him, Samuel Morrison studied a creased piece of paper that might once have been white. Sam shared his older brother's solid build and steady demeanor, though his eyes held a gentler quality, like someone who still believed the world might surprise him in pleasant ways. "Turn left at the old mailbox," Sam said, consulting the hand-drawn map their uncle's lawyer had provided. "Should be about 2 miles down this dirt road." Jacob nodded, downshifting as they approached a rusted mailbox that leaned at a precarious angle. The name Morrison was barely visible beneath layers of weather and neglect. A chain hung where a gate once secured the entrance, but the gate itself had long since surrendered to gravity and rust. The dirt road wound through stands of pine and aspen, their leaves already showing the first hints of autumn gold. Dust rose behind them in lazy clouds, settling on everything like a benediction of earth. Neither brother spoke as they drove deeper into what was now, according to Uncle Henry's last will and testament, their property. They crested a small hill, and there it was, the Morrison family farm that nobody else had wanted. The farmhouse squatted in a clearing like a tired old dog, its white paint peeling in long strips that fluttered in the mountain breeze. The roof sagged in the middle, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had weathered to the color of old bones. A front porch wrapped around 2 sides of the house, its railing broken in several places. Though the basic structure looked sound enough, beyond the house stood a red barn that had faded to the color of dried blood. Its massive doors hung open like a mouth frozen mid-yawn, revealing darkness within. The barn leaned slightly to one side, as if it had grown weary of standing upright after so many decades of service. Jacob stopped the truck in what had once been a circular driveway, now overgrown with weeds and volunteer saplings. The silence after he turned off the engine was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "Well," Sam said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of wonder and dismay, "here we are." They climbed out of the truck, their boots crunching on gravel that was more memory than substance. Jacob pulled Uncle Henry's will from his jacket pocket, the legal document that had changed their lives 3 weeks ago when the lawyer called to inform them they had inherited property in Montana. Property of approximately 160 acres. Jacob read aloud, including farmhouse built circa 1923, barn and outbuildings, to be divided equally between surviving nephews Jacob William Morrison and Samuel Thomas Morrison. Sam kicked at a rusted horseshoe half buried in the weeds. Uncle Henry never mentioned owning a farm, never mentioned much of anything really. He was Dad's brother, but they lost touch after Grandpa died, Jacob said. "Must have been 30 years since we saw him last." They approached the farmhouse slowly, like men approaching a sleeping bear they weren't sure was friendly. The front steps creaked ominously under their weight, but they held. Jacob produced a brass key from the envelope the lawyer had given them. Its metal green with age. The front door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty rooms beyond. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that slanted through the windows, and the air carried the musty smell of a house that had been waiting too long for human voices. "Power's been shut off for years," Sam observed, flipping a light switch that clicked uselessly. "No phone service either, I'd imagine." They moved through the rooms, like archaeologists exploring a recently discovered tomb. The furniture was covered with white sheets that had yellowed with time, giving everything a ghostly appearance. In the living room, a stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold but clean, as if Uncle Henry had tended it right up until the end. The kitchen held the most promise, with a cast-iron stove that looked like it could still function and a hand-pumped well that might still draw water. Mason jars lined shelves along one wall, their contents long since spoiled, but their potential intact. "What do you think?" Sam asked, running his finger along a windowsill and coming away with enough dust to plant crops. Jacob looked around the kitchen, then out the window toward the barn and the rolling hills beyond. "I think Uncle Henry left us something nobody else wanted because nobody else could see what it might become." "Question is," Sam said quietly, "can we?" The farmhouse revealed its secrets slowly, like an old man sharing stories he'd kept locked away for decades. Jacob and Samuel spent the morning moving through rooms that held the accumulated possessions of a life lived quietly and alone. Uncle Henry had been a collector of practical things. Mason jars, sorted by size, lengths of rope coiled and hung on nails, and tools cleaned and oiled, despite years of disuse. In what had once been the master bedroom, Sam discovered a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. The lock had long since rusted away, and the lid opened with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of memory. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper that crumbled at his touch, lay Uncle Henry's personal journal. The leather cover was worn smooth by handling, and the pages filled with Henry's careful script in fading blue ink. Sam carried it to the kitchen where Jacob was attempting to coax water from the hand pump. "Look at this," Sam said, opening the journal to a random page. Uncle Henry kept detailed records of everything. Weather, crop yields, livestock purchases. Jacob paused in his pumping to glance over his brother's shoulder. The entries were methodical, precise, the work of a man who understood that details mattered. But as Sam turned the pages, they noticed something else. Scattered throughout the practical observations were cryptic references that seemed out of place. "Foundation work continues slowly." Jacob read aloud from an entry dated 3 summers ago. "The treasure beneath requires patience. What others cannot see will provide for those who understand the land's true gifts." Sam turned more pages, finding similar references sprinkled throughout the months. Deep excavation in the western section proves promising. The old maps speak truth for those who know how to listen. Fortune favors not just the brave, but the persistent. What do you think he meant? Sam asked, settling into one of the kitchen chairs that creaked but held his weight. Before Jacob could answer, a knock at the front door echoed through the house. Both brothers exchanged glances. They weren't expecting visitors, and the farmhouse sat far enough from the main road that casual callers were unlikely. Jacob opened the door to find an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes the color of winter sky. She wore a practical dress covered by a hand-knitted sweater, and her weathered hands held a covered dish that smelled of fresh bread. "You must be Henry's nephews," she said without preamble. "I'm Martha Kellerman. I live in the yellow house about a mile down the valley. Thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal while you're getting settled. That's very kind of you, Mrs. Kellerman," Sam said, accepting the dish gratefully. "I'm Samuel, and this is my brother Jacob." Martha's eyes swept past them to take in the interior of the house. "Henry was a good neighbor," she said. "Quiet man, kept to himself mostly, but he'd always lend a hand when someone needed help. This place meant everything to him. Did he ever mention family?" Jacob asked. "We hadn't seen him in 30 years. He talked about his nephew sometimes, Martha said, stepping into the kitchen and looking around with the familiarity of someone who had visited often. Said you boys had good hearts but hard luck. Worried about you both, especially after your parents passed. She paused at the kitchen table where Uncle Henry's journal lay open. Her expression shifted, becoming more guarded. I see you've found Henry's writings. Some of his entries seem unusual, Sam said carefully. References to treasure and excavation work. Martha was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the journals. Pages. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of shared secrets. Henry was convinced this land held more than most people realized. Spent years researching the property's history, studying old geological surveys. Most folks thought he was chasing shadows, but you didn't. Jacob asked. Henry was many things, but he wasn't a fool, Martha said. He had his reasons for believing what he believed. Whether those reasons were sound, well, that's for you boys to determine. She moved toward the door, then turned back. If you decide to stay and work this place, you should know that Henry faced his share of troubles. There were people who wanted this land, made him offers he refused. Some of them weren't particularly gracious about his refusal. What kind of troubles? Sam asked. The kind that make a man careful about who he trusts, Martha said. Henry installed extra locks on his doors and kept a shotgun by his bed. Said the land would provide for the right people, but it would also attract the wrong ones. After Martha left, the brothers sat in the kitchen as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor. Uncle Henry's journal lay between them, like a puzzle waiting to be solved. What do you think? Sam asked. Stay and see what Uncle Henry was so interested in, or cut our losses and sell the place. Jacob looked out the window toward the barn, where something glinted in the late sunlight streaming through the gaps in the weathered siding. I think Uncle Henry left us this place for a reason. Maybe it's time we found out what that reason was. The barn stood like a weathered sentinel against the morning sky. Its red paint faded to the color of dried clay. Jacob pushed open the massive doors, their hinges protesting with the screech of metal that had seen too many seasons without oil. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that penetrated the interior, illuminating a space that held decades of accumulated farm equipment and forgotten dreams. Samuel followed his brother into the cavernous interior, their footsteps echoing off the rafters where barn swallows had built their nests. The air smelled of hay long since turned to dust, old leather, and something else, something mineral and earthy that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Look at the size of this place, Sam said, his voice carrying a note of wonder. Uncle Henry could have stored equipment for 3 farms in here. The barn stretched nearly 60 feet from end to end, with a loft that ran the full length of the building. Wooden posts as thick as tree trunks supported the structure, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of use. Along the walls, hand tools hung from wooden pegs, each implement cleaned and oiled despite years of disuse. Jacob climbed the ladder to the loft, his boots finding purchase on rungs that felt solid despite their age. The upper level held a surprising discovery, carefully arranged mining equipment that looked far too sophisticated for simple farm use. Pickaxes with heads that showed signs of recent sharpening, coils of rope that appeared nearly new, and a collection of wooden boxes that contained rock samples labeled with dates and locations. Sam, you need to see this, Jacob called down, his voice tight with excitement. Samuel climbed up to find his brother examining an antique mining pick, its wooden handle worn smooth by hands that had used it for serious work. The metal head was clean and sharp, recently maintained despite the tool's obvious age. Why would Uncle Henry need mining equipment? Sam asked, taking the pick from his brother's hands. The tool felt balanced and purposeful, designed for breaking through rock rather than turning soil. Jacob moved to one of the wooden boxes and opened it carefully. Inside, dozens of rock samples lay cushioned in old newspaper, each one tagged with a small paper label. The dates went back 5 years, and the locations were all marked as various points around the property. But what caught their attention was the content of the rocks themselves. Several samples showed clear veins of something that glinted in the dim light. "These look like ore samples," Sam said, holding one up to catch the light streaming through a gap in the barn siding. "See those metallic streaks running through the rock?" They climbed back down to the main floor, carrying several samples with them. Jacob knelt beside one of the massive support posts and noticed something that made him pause. The wooden floor around the post showed signs of disturbance, as if boards had been removed and replaced multiple times. "Help me move this equipment," Jacob said, pointing to a collection of old farm implements that sat near the post. "I want to get a better look at the flooring." Together, they shifted aside a rusty cultivator and several wooden crates. With the area clear, the pattern became obvious. A section of floorboards about 6 feet square had been cut and refitted, the wood slightly different in color from the surrounding planks. Sam ran his fingers along the edge of one board, feeling where it had been carefully cut and reinstalled. Uncle Henry was digging under here. Question is, what was he looking for? Jacob studied the rock samples they'd brought down from the loft. In the better light of the main floor, the metallic veins in the stone were unmistakable. He'd seen enough geology textbooks during his brief stint in community college to recognize the telltale signs of mineral deposits. "Maybe the better question," Jacob said slowly, "is what was he finding?" They spent the next hour examining the barn floor more carefully. The section near the support post wasn't the only area that showed signs of excavation. A careful inspection revealed that Uncle Henry had been systematically exploring the ground beneath the barn, working in a grid pattern that suggested serious geological investigation rather than casual curiosity. Near the back wall of the barn, they found the most telling evidence yet: a collection of hand tools specifically designed for geological work, including a small hand drill and collection bags for soil samples. Everything was clean and organized, the work of someone who understood that proper technique mattered. Martha said Uncle Henry spent years researching this property, Sam said, examining a soil auger that looked like it had seen recent use. Maybe he found something that convinced him to start digging. Jacob picked up the mining pick again, feeling its weight and balance. "Only one way to find out what's down there," he said. "We start where Uncle Henry left off." The brothers looked at each other across the dusty barn floor, both understanding that they stood at a crossroads. They could sell the property and walk away, or they could follow their uncle's mysterious path into the earth beneath their feet. Outside, a hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the Montana landscape like a question waiting for an answer. The crowbar felt heavy in Jacob's hands as he positioned it against the edge of the modified floorboard. Samuel knelt beside him, both brothers sharing the nervous energy of men about to uncover a secret that had been buried for years. The barn around them seemed to hold its breath, dust motes suspended in the afternoon light like tiny witnesses to their discovery. "You sure about this?" Sam asked, though his tone suggested he'd already made up his mind. "Once we start pulling up Uncle Henry's work, there's no going back." Jacob nodded grimly. Uncle Henry spent 5 years preparing this spot. Whatever he found down there was important enough to keep secret from everyone, except maybe Martha. The first board came up with surprising ease, as if Uncle Henry had designed his excavation for exactly this moment. The wood had been cut precisely and fitted with small metal brackets that allowed for easy removal. As they lifted away the planks, the brothers revealed a carefully excavated shaft that descended into darkness below the barn floor. The bottom of the shaft opened into a natural cave that had been expanded and reinforced with timber supports. Jacob's flashlight beam swept across walls of exposed rock that told the story of millions of years of geological activity. But what stopped his breath entirely was what the light revealed running through the rock face in thick, unmistakable veins. "Sam!" Jacob called up, his voice tight with disbelief. "You need to get down here right now." Samuel descended quickly, bringing a second flashlight and Uncle Henry's collection of rock samples for comparison. When his feet touched the cave floor and he turned to see what had captured his brother's attention, He let out a low whistle that echoed off the stone walls. Gold, not just traces or hints, but thick veins of the precious metal running through the exposed rock face, like molten rivers frozen in stone. The veins were substantial, some as thick as a man's thumb, weaving through the cave walls in patterns that suggested a significant deposit extending far beyond what they could see. "This can't be real," Sam whispered, approaching the nearest vein and running his fingers along the metal that gleamed in their flashlight beams. This much gold, this close to the surface, someone would have found it years ago. Jacob examined Uncle Henry's rock samples, comparing them to the exposed veins around them. The matches were perfect. Their uncle had been systematically mapping this deposit, documenting its extent and purity with the patience of a man who understood he'd found something extraordinary. "Maybe someone did find it," Jacob said quietly. "Maybe Uncle Henry found it and kept it secret for a reason." They spent the next hour exploring the cave system that Uncle Henry had partially excavated. The main chamber was just the beginning. Careful digging had revealed connecting passages that extended in multiple directions, following the gold veins deeper into the earth. Uncle Henry had marked his progress with small stakes and string, creating a primitive but effective survey of the underground treasure. In one of the side passages, Sam discovered a wooden crate that contained Uncle Henry's most recent findings. Chunks of gold-bearing ore filled the box, some pieces showing such high concentrations of the metal that they gleamed like jewelry in the flashlight beams. A handwritten note lay on top of the ore samples, dated just 3 months before Uncle Henry's death. "The deposit extends at least 200 feet in all directions," Jacob read aloud from his uncle's careful script. "Conservative estimate suggests enough gold to support a family for several generations. But secrecy remains essential. Others have begun asking questions about my activities." They climbed back to the barn floor as the sun began to set, their minds reeling from the magnitude of their discovery. The wooden planks that concealed the shaft seemed suddenly inadequate protection for the fortune that lay beneath their feet. "We're rich," Sam said simply, stating the obvious truth that neither brother had yet fully grasped. "We're also in danger," Jacob replied, remembering Martha's warnings about people who had wanted to buy the property. "Uncle Henry kept this secret for 5 years. Question is, can we?" Samuel drove the 30 miles to the county courthouse in silence, Uncle Henry's rock samples wrapped carefully in an old towel on the seat beside him. Jacob had stayed at the farm to begin securing their discovery, but Sam knew they needed official confirmation of what they'd found before making any decisions about their next steps. The courthouse was a solid brick building that had weathered decades of Montana winters with stoic determination. Inside, the county clerk's office smelled of old paper and bureaucratic patience. Sam requested access to the geological survey records for their property, explaining that he was researching the history of his recently inherited farm. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain, led him to a back room filled with filing cabinets and map cases. "Most folks don't bother with the old geological surveys," she said, pulling out a thick folder marked with their property coordinates. "But there's been more interest lately. Someone else was in here asking about the same section just a few months ago." Sam's pulse quickened. "Do you remember who?" Man in an expensive suit drove a black sedan. Said he was representing potential investors interested in the area. She handed him the folder. "Seemed very interested in the 1889 territorial survey. That one goes back to when this was still frontier country." Sam opened the folder carefully, revealing hand-drawn maps and typed reports that documented the geological composition of their land over more than a century. The 1889 survey was particularly detailed, conducted by a team of territorial geologists who had examined the entire valley for mineral potential. His breath caught as he read the faded typescript. Significant gold-bearing quartz veins, identified in sections 12 through 15, extending from surface limestone formations into underlying granite substrata. Preliminary assay suggests commercially viable concentrations throughout the surveyed area. The map that accompanied the report showed their property highlighted in yellow, with detailed notations about the gold deposit's extent and estimated value. Uncle Henry's excavation had been precisely positioned to intersect the richest part of the vein system, identified by the territorial surveyors. The survey team recommended immediate development. Sam read from the conclusion, but political instability and lack of transportation infrastructure prevented commercial exploitation at that time. He photographed the relevant pages with his phone, then requested access to more recent geological studies. The county records revealed a pattern of periodic interest in their property, with mining companies conducting exploratory surveys every few decades. Each study confirmed the presence of significant gold deposits, but various factors, economic downturns, world wars, environmental regulations, had prevented development. Back at the farm, Sam found Jacob installing a padlock on the barn doors and positioning several pieces of farming equipment to block direct access to the excavation site. His brother looked up as a truck approached, relief evident on his weathered face. "What did you find?" Jacob asked, helping Sam carry the research materials into the farmhouse. Sam spread the photocopied survey maps across the kitchen table, pointing to the highlighted sections that corresponded to their property boundaries. Uncle Henry knew exactly what he was doing. This deposit has been documented for over a century, but nobody's been able to develop it. Jacob studied the maps, comparing them to Uncle Henry's hand-drawn excavation plans. According to this territorial survey, the main vein runs right under our barn and extends all the way to the creek. That's got to be thousands of ounces of gold. Conservative estimate from the 1889 team was 40,000 ounces in the accessible portions alone, Sam said, pointing to the surveyor's calculations. At current prices, that's worth about $70 million. The brothers sat in stunned silence, the magnitude of their inheritance settling over them like dust after an explosion. Everything they'd known about their lives had changed in the space of a few hours, but the change felt more like a burden than a blessing. "The county clerk mentioned someone else asking about our property," Sam said quietly. "Man in an expensive suit, driving a black sedan. Sounds like the kind of person Martha warned us about." Jacob moved to the window, looking out toward the barn, where their future lay hidden beneath wooden planks and shadows. "Uncle Henry kept this secret for 5 years. Makes me wonder what happened to change that." Sam pulled out the final document from the county records, a death certificate for Henry Morrison, dated 3 months after his last journal entry about the gold deposit. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the timing felt too convenient to be coincidental. "We need to be smart about this," Sam said. "Uncle Henry had 5 years to figure out how to extract this gold safely and legally. We need to understand why he never did." Jacob continued, staring out the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. Maybe he was waiting for the right people to find it, people he could trust to handle it properly. Outside, the Montana evening painted the sky in shades of gold that seemed to mock the treasure hidden beneath their feet. The black sedan appeared on the 3rd morning after their discovery, crawling down the dirt road like a predator testing unfamiliar territory. Jacob spotted it first from the barn, where he was reinforcing the wooden planks that concealed their excavation. The car moved too slowly for casual traffic, its occupants clearly studying the property rather than simply passing through. Samuel emerged from the farmhouse carrying 2 cups of coffee, his movements deliberate and unhurried, despite the tension that suddenly filled the mountain air. Both brothers watched as the sedan pulled to a stop near their pickup truck, its engine ticking in the morning quiet like a countdown timer. 2 men emerged from the vehicle. The driver was tall and lean, wearing a suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. His companion was broader, built like someone who solved problems with his hands rather than his words. They moved with the casual confidence of men accustomed to getting what they wanted. "Gentlemen," the well-dressed man called out, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a salesman. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? I'm Vincent Cross, representing Cross Mining Enterprises. "This is my associate, Mr. Burke." Jacob set down his hammer and walked toward the visitors, Samuel falling into step beside him. Neither brother offered to shake hands, a deliberate rudeness that Cross noted with a slight tightening around his eyes. "We're not interested in selling," Jacob said without preamble. "If that's why you're here, you can save yourself some time." Cross smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Now that's putting the cart before the horse, isn't it? I haven't even made you an offer yet, though I have to say, this property has some interesting characteristics that might make it worth more than you'd expect." "What kind of characteristics?" Samuel asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the warning bells ringing in his head. "Oh, historical significance mostly," Cross said, his gaze sweeping across the barn and outbuildings with obvious interest. "Your Uncle Henry was quite the local character. Spent a lot of time researching the geological heritage of this area. Very thorough man, from what I understand." Burke remained silent, but his attention focused on the barn doors, where fresh scratches in the wood revealed recent activity. His eyes missed nothing, cataloguing details with the systematic attention of someone conducting surveillance. "Uncle Henry was a private man," Jacob said carefully. "We're still going through his belongings, trying to understand what he was working on." Of course," Cross nodded sympathetically. "Inheriting property can be overwhelming, especially when it comes with so much history attached. That's why I'm here, actually. Gross Mining has experience dealing with properties that have, shall we say, complicated geological situations." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain morning. "What makes you think our geology is complicated?" Gross reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which he handed to Samuel with a flourish. "Anonymous tip, actually. Someone called our office last week, suggested we might want to take a look at this property. Said there might be mineral rights issues that could affect the land's value." The paper was a photocopy of the 1889 Territorial Survey, the same document Samuel had discovered at the county courthouse. But this copy included additional annotations in red ink, marking specific locations where the original surveyors had identified the richest gold concentrations. "Where did you get this?" Samuel demanded, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Public records, mostly," Cross said with a shrug that was entirely too casual. "Amazing what you can find when you know where to look." The territorial government was very thorough in documenting mineral deposits, even when they couldn't develop them immediately. Jacob studied the annotated survey, noting that someone had drawn precise circles around the area directly beneath their barn. The anonymous tipster had known exactly where to direct Cross's attention. "The thing is," Cross continued, "developing mineral resources requires significant capital investment and specialized knowledge. It's not the kind of work that individuals can typically handle on their own. That's where companies like mine come in." "We're not interested in partners," Jacob said firmly. Cross's smile became predatory. "Oh, I'm not talking about partnership. I'm talking about purchasing the property outright. Cash deal, quick closing, no complications. I'm prepared to offer $800,000, which is considerably more than farmland in this area typically brings." Samuel folded the survey document carefully, buying time to think. $800,000 was more money than either brother had ever dreamed of possessing, but it represented a fraction of the gold deposit's actual value. Cross was betting on their ignorance and desperation. "We'll need time to consider your offer," Samuel said. Burke spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone making a statement rather than a suggestion. "Time has a way of running out when you're not careful. Properties like this can attract all kinds of unwanted attention." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Jacob felt his hands clench into fists, but Samuel placed a warning hand on his brother's arm. "We appreciate your interest," Samuel said evenly. "We'll be in touch if we decide to sell." Cross handed Samuel a business card, the paper thick and expensive between his fingers. "Don't wait too long, gentlemen. Opportunities like this don't last forever." The black sedan disappeared down the dirt road. leaving behind only dust and the lingering sense that their lives had just become considerably more complicated. The surveillance photographs arrived 2 days later, slipped under the farmhouse door sometime before dawn, when even the earliest birds were still silent in their roosts. Jacob found them when he stepped outside to check the morning sky. 5 glossy prints scattered across the porch like fallen leaves that carried poisonous messages. The images showed the brothers in stark black and white detail. Jacob climbing down into the excavation shaft, Samuel carrying rock samples from the barn, both men examining the territorial survey documents by lamplight in the kitchen. Someone had been watching them with professional equipment and patience, documenting their every move around the property. Samuel studied the photographs with the careful attention of a man trying to understand how badly his privacy had been violated. The images were taken from multiple angles and distances, suggesting surveillance equipment positioned in several locations around the farm. Whoever was watching them had invested significant resources in the operation. Professional work, Samuel observed, noting the quality of the telephoto shots and the precision of the timing. These weren't taken by some curious neighbor with a camera. Jacob turned one of the photographs over, finding a handwritten message in block letters that carried the cold efficiency of a business transaction. Your property is under constant observation. Accept Mr. Cross's generous offer before the situation becomes more complicated. They're not even pretending to be subtle anymore, Jacob said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Whoever they are, they want us scared enough to sell without asking questions. Samuel walked to the kitchen window, scanning the tree line for any sign of hidden watchers. The morning landscape looked peaceful and innocent, but the photographs proved that appearances could be dangerously misleading. Somewhere out there, professional eyes were cataloging their movements and transmitting information to Vincent Cross. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the tense silence like a blade. Samuel answered on the second ring, expecting to hear Cross's voice delivering another veiled threat. Instead, he found himself speaking with Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his reputation for stubbornness when it came to protecting his county's residents. Mr. Morrison, I got your message about strangers asking questions around your property, Sheriff Bradley said, without preamble. Thought I'd better come out and take a look at the situation personally. Samuel had called the sheriff's office the previous evening, reporting the suspicious sedan and the men who seemed unusually interested in their farm. He hadn't mentioned the gold discovery, but he'd expressed concern about potential harassment from unwanted buyers. We'd appreciate that, Sheriff, Samuel said. Things have escalated since we spoke. Sheriff Bradley arrived within the hour, driving a dust-covered patrol car that looked like it had seen every mile of mountain road in the county. He was a compact man, with graying hair and eyes that missed very little, carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone who had dealt with every kind of trouble the Montana wilderness could produce. Jacob showed him the surveillance photographs, watching the sheriff's expression grow increasingly grim as he examined each image. Sheriff Bradley had seen enough criminal activity to recognize professional intimidation when it crossed his desk. This is harassment. Pure and simple, Sheriff Bradley said, studying the technical quality of the photographs. Expensive equipment, careful positioning, systematic documentation. Someone's invested serious money in watching your property. Any idea who might be behind it? Samuel asked. Got some suspicions, the sheriff replied. Vincent Cross and his company have been active in this area for the past few months, asking questions about mineral rights and property availability. Always stays just inside the boundaries of legal behavior. But he's got a reputation for getting what he wants. Sheriff Bradley walked around the property, his trained eyes noting the fresh scratches on the barn doors, the tire tracks from the black sedan, and the sight lines that would provide the best surveillance positions. He spent considerable time examining the tree line where the telephoto shots had likely been taken. Here's what I can do officially, Sheriff Bradley said when he finished his inspection. "I can increase patrols in this area and document any further harassment. If Cross or his people set foot on your property without permission, I can arrest them for trespassing. What about unofficially?" Jacob asked. The sheriff's expression grew more serious. "Unofficially, I'd advise you to be very careful about who you trust. Cross has resources and connections that extend beyond what most people can handle on their own. If there's something on this property that he wants badly enough to invest in surveillance, he's not going to give up just because you refuse his offer." Sheriff Bradley climbed back into his patrol car, but rolled down the window before driving away. "One more thing, gentlemen. If you're sitting on something valuable, you might want to consider getting some legal advice about protecting your interests. Cross has a team of lawyers who specialize in acquiring property from reluctant sellers." As the patrol car disappeared down the dirt road, the brothers stood in their farmyard, feeling more isolated than ever. The surveillance photographs had transformed their property from a refuge into a fishbowl, and Vincent Cross was clearly prepared to escalate his pressure until they surrendered to his demands. Vincent Cross returned 3 days later, but this time he arrived alone and carried himself with the demeanor of a man delivering an ultimatum rather than making a sales pitch. His black sedan kicked up dust clouds that hung in the still air like smoke signals announcing the arrival of trouble. Jacob and Samuel watched him approach from the farmhouse porch, both brothers having agreed that any future conversations with Cross would take place in the open, where surveillance cameras couldn't capture private discussions. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called out a warning that seemed particularly appropriate. Cross stepped out of his sedan, wearing the same expensive suit, but his demeanor had shifted from predatory charm to barely concealed impatience. He carried a leather briefcase that suggested serious business rather than casual negotiation. "Gentlemen," Cross said without his previous false warmth, "I hope you've had time to consider my offer. I'm afraid circumstances have changed somewhat since our last conversation." "What kind of circumstances?" Samuel asked, though he suspected the answer would involve increased pressure rather than improved terms. Cross opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of documents, spreading them across the hood of his sedan like a general displaying battle plans. The papers included property assessments, mineral rights documentation, and what appeared to be legal briefs prepared by expensive attorneys. "It seems your property has some complicated legal issues that weren't immediately apparent," Cross said, his tone suggesting regret, while his eyes showed satisfaction. "Mineral rights dating back to territorial days, environmental concerns related to potential contamination, zoning complications that could affect future development." Jacob examined the documents, noting that each issue raised questions about their clear ownership of the property and their right to develop any resources they might discover. The legal language was dense and intimidating, clearly designed to overwhelm rather than inform. "These problems could tie up your property in court for years," Cross continued. "Legal fees alone would bankrupt most people, and there's no guarantee you'd win, even with the best representation." Samuel recognized the strategy immediately. Cross was creating legal complications that didn't exist, then positioning himself as the solution to problems he'd manufactured. It was sophisticated intimidation, wrapped in the language of business negotiation. "However," Cross said, producing a second set of documents, "Cross Mining Enterprises has experience dealing with these exact issues. We're prepared to purchase the property despite these complications, assuming responsibility for all legal problems and associated costs." The purchase agreement he presented was significantly different from his original offer. The price had dropped to $400,000, with clauses that would allow Cross to reduce the payment further if additional complications arose during the closing process. "You're trying to steal our land," Jacob said bluntly. Abandoning any pretense of polite negotiation, Cross's mask of civility finally slipped. revealing the cold calculation underneath. "I'm trying to save you from a situation that's already beyond your ability to handle. You're small-town men who've stumbled into big city problems. The smart move is to take what you can get and walk away." He reached into his jacket and withdrew Vincent Cross's business card. But this version included additional information printed in small text along the bottom. Samuel read the fine print and felt his blood run cold. "Licensed mining contractor, federal permits pending, environmental assessment certified. You're already planning to develop this property," Samuel realized. "These legal complications you're talking about, you've already solved them for yourself." "I've done my homework," Cross admitted without shame. "Filed the appropriate paperwork, secured the necessary permits, established relationships with the right people. Development of this property is going to happen one way or another. The only question is whether you participate in the profits or get crushed by the process." Jacob stepped closer to Cross, his hands clenched at his sides. "And if we refuse your generous offer?" Cross closed his briefcase with deliberate precision, the sound echoing like a coffin lid settling into place. "Then you'll discover that rural properties can be surprisingly vulnerable to all kinds of unfortunate incidents. Equipment failures, structural collapses, fires that start from unknown causes. Insurance companies are notoriously reluctant to pay claims when properties are involved in legal disputes." The threat was delivered with the casual tone of a man discussing weather patterns, but the menace was unmistakable. Cross was promising escalating harassment that would continue until the brothers surrendered or were driven away entirely. "You have 48 hours to accept my offer," Cross said, climbing back into his sedan. "After that, I'm afraid the price will need to be adjusted downward to reflect the increased complications you'll be facing." As the black sedan disappeared down the dirt road, Samuel examined the business card Cross had left behind. Hidden on the back, written in pencil so faint it was barely visible, was a phone number with a handwritten note. "Sheriff Bradley, compromised. Trust no one in uniform." The brothers stood in their farmyard, surrounded by the Montana wilderness that no longer felt like sanctuary, understanding that they were facing an enemy with resources and connections that extended far beyond their ability to fight using conventional methods. The argument erupted in the farmhouse kitchen like a thunderstorm that had been building pressure for days. Jacob paced between the window and the table, where Cross's documents lay scattered like accusations, his frustration finally boiling over into words that cut deeper than either brother intended. "We should take the money and run," Jacob said, his voice tight with anger that wasn't entirely directed at his brother. $400,000 is more than we've ever had, more than we ever dreamed of having." Samuel sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold hours ago. Uncle Henry's journal lay open beside Cross's legal papers. The contrast between honest documentation and manufactured complications stark in the afternoon light. "It's not about the money, Jake," Samuel said quietly. "It's about letting them win. Uncle Henry spent 5 years protecting this place from people like Cross. If we sell now, we're betraying everything he worked for." "Uncle Henry is dead," Jacob snapped, his patience finally exhausted. "Maybe he died because he was too stubborn to know when he was beaten. You want to end up the same way." The words hung between them like a physical blow. Samuel looked up from his coffee, his eyes reflecting pain that went deeper than their current crisis. In all their years together, through poverty and hardship and loss, the brothers had never questioned each other's courage or commitment. "I'm sorry," Jacob said immediately, "but the damage was already spreading like cracks in ice." "I didn't mean that. I'm just scared, Sam. We're in over our heads here." Samuel stood and walked to the window, looking out toward the barn where their fortune lay hidden beneath wooden planks and shadows. The Montana landscape stretched beyond their property in all directions, vast and indifferent to human struggles over ownership and wealth. "When we were kids," Samuel said softly, "Dad used to tell us that Morrison men don't run from fights. Said our grandfather came to Montana with nothing but determination. and built something that lasted. That's what Uncle Henry was trying to protect. Dad also died broken, Jacob replied, though his voice had lost its earlier heat. Sometimes running from a fight is the smart thing to do. They stood in silence, the weight of their disagreement settling over the kitchen like dust after an explosion. Outside, a hawk circled overhead, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark called out a song that sounded like longing. A knock at the front door interrupted their standoff. Both brothers tensed, expecting to see Cross's black sedan in the driveway, but instead they found Martha Kellerman standing on their porch, holding a covered dish and wearing an expression that suggested she'd come for more than a social visit. "Afternoon. Boys," Martha said, stepping into the kitchen without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes took in the scattered documents and the tension between the brothers, with the practiced assessment of someone who had raised 5 children and understood family dynamics. "Heard you had some visitors," Martha continued, setting her dish on the counter and examining Cross's legal papers with obvious disapproval. "Vincent Cross has a reputation for stirring up trouble where none existed before." Samuel was surprised by her directness. "You know about Cross?" "Know about him, yes. Trust him? Absolutely not." Martha pulled out a kitchen chair and settled herself with the authority of someone who intended to stay until she'd said her piece. "Cross tried to buy my property 2 years ago. Started with a reasonable offer, then began manufacturing problems when I refused to sell." She reached into her purse and withdrew a faded photograph that showed a much younger Henry Morrison standing beside a mining operation that looked remarkably similar to the excavation beneath their barn. Henry wore work clothes and held a mining pick, his face showing the satisfaction of a man who'd found what he was looking for. "Your uncle wasn't the first Morrison to work this land," Martha said, handing them the photograph. "Your great-grandfather started the original excavation back in 1923, right after he bought the property. He knew about the gold deposits, but the Depression killed his financing before he could develop them properly." Jacob studied the photograph, noting the family resemblance between his great-grandfather and Uncle Henry. Both men shared the same determined expression, the same careful attention to detail that had characterized Uncle Henry's recent excavation work. "Henry spent years researching the family history," Martha continued. "Found his father's original mining claims, documented the geological surveys, even located some of the equipment his father had hidden when the bank foreclosed. He was preparing to restart the mining operation when Cross started making his offers." Samuel felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Uncle Henry wasn't just protecting a discovery, he was protecting a family legacy. "More than that," Martha said, her voice carrying the weight of secrets she'd kept for too long. "He was protecting you boys. Henry knew he was dying, knew his heart wouldn't last much longer. Everything he did was preparation for the day you'd inherit this place and have to face the same choices he faced." She stood and moved toward the door, then turned back with an expression that reminded both brothers of their mother during her most serious moments. "Henry left you more than gold, boys. He left you a choice about what kind of men you want to be. Question is whether you're brave enough to honor his faith in you." The reconciliation came at dawn, when both brothers found themselves standing in the barn without having planned to meet there. Samuel arrived first, carrying Uncle Henry's mining equipment and a thermos of coffee that steamed in the cool mountain air. Jacob appeared minutes later, his hands full of surveying tools and a determination that matched the sunrise breaking over the eastern peaks. "I was wrong yesterday," Jacob said without preamble, setting down his equipment near the concealed excavation site. "About running, about Uncle Henry, about what we owe to the people who came before us." Samuel poured coffee into 2 metal cups, the liquid dark and strong enough to dissolve doubt. "I was wrong too, about not considering your concerns. Cross is dangerous, and we can't fight him by pretending he's not." They stood beside the wooden planks that concealed their fortune, both understanding that their argument had been about more than money or safety. It had been about identity, about choosing between the men they were and the men they might become under pressure. "So what do we do?" Jacob asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "We can't sell, but we can't ignore Cross either." Samuel pulled out a hand-drawn map he'd been working on since Martha's visit, combining Uncle Henry's excavation notes with the historical surveys and his own observations about the property's geology. The document showed a systematic approach to gold extraction that would take months to complete properly. "We mine it ourselves," Samuel said simply. "Carefully, safely, legally. Extract enough gold to establish our financial independence, then use that security to fight Cross on equal terms." Jacob studied the map, noting the careful planning that went into every detail. Samuel had marked safe excavation routes, calculated extraction timelines, and identified equipment needs with the thoroughness of a professional mining engineer. "This would take at least 6 months, Jacob observed. "Can we stay ahead of Cross that long?" "And not if we try to do it alone," Samuel admitted. "But Martha's son, Thomas, has mining experience from his time in Colorado. And there are other people in the valley who have reasons to want Cross stopped." They spent the morning removing the wooden planks and descending into Uncle Henry's excavation, this time bringing proper lighting and measuring equipment. The gold veins were even more extensive than their initial exploration had revealed, running through the cave walls in patterns that suggested a deposit worth far more than the conservative estimates in the territorial surveys. Jacob set up a systematic grid for mapping the vein structure while Samuel documented the geological composition with photographs and detailed notes. Working together in the underground chamber, they fell into the easy rhythm of brothers who had learned to trust each other's abilities. "Look at this," Samuel called from one of the side passages, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Uncle Henry barely scratched the surface. "This vein extends at least 50 feet in this direction alone." Jacob joined his brother in the narrow passage, their headlamps revealing gold deposits that gleamed like captured sunlight in the rock face. Uncle Henry's excavation had exposed perhaps 10% of the actual treasure hidden beneath their property. "We're not just sitting on a small fortune," Jacob said, his voice filled with wonder. "We're sitting on generational wealth, enough gold to secure our families for decades." They climbed back to the surface as the sun reached its zenith, both brothers carrying rock samples that would need proper assay testing. The barn around them felt different now, transformed from a simple farm building into the entrance to their family's legacy. Samuel pulled out Uncle Henry's journal and turned to a page he'd marked during their morning's work. Uncle Henry's careful script documented his own realization about the deposit's true extent, written in the careful language of a man who understood the magnitude of his discovery. Conservative extraction over 5 years would yield approximately 3,000 ounces annually. Jacob read from his uncle's calculations. Proper development could support sustainable mining for 20 years or more. The brothers looked at each other across Uncle Henry's journal, both understanding that they held the key to transforming not just their own lives, but the economic future of their entire valley. The responsibility felt almost as heavy as the opportunity. "There's something else," Samuel said, pointing to a final entry in Uncle Henry's journal. He wasn't just planning to mine the gold. He was planning to use the profits to establish a foundation that would protect other family farms in the valley from people like Cross. Jacob felt the weight of legacy settling over his shoulders like a familiar coat. Uncle Henry hadn't just left them a treasure. He'd left them a mission that extended far beyond personal enrichment. "Then that's what we do," Jacob said. "We mine the gold, we build the foundation, and we make sure Cross never gets his hands on another family's heritage." Outside, a meadowlark called out a song that sounded like approval, and the Montana sky stretched endlessly blue above their heads. The hidden letter revealed itself by accident, discovered when Samuel was examining Uncle Henry's journal more carefully in the afternoon light. The binding had begun to separate after decades of use, and as he turned to a page near the back, a folded piece of paper slipped from between the leather cover and the spine, where it had been concealed for years. The paper was different from the journal pages, heavier stock that suggested importance. Uncle Henry's familiar handwriting covered both sides in the careful script he reserved for his most serious thoughts. The date at the top showed it had been written just 3 months before his death, around the time Cross had first started making inquiries about the property. "Jacob," Samuel called, his voice tight with discovery. "You need to read this." Jacob set down the mining equipment he'd been organizing and joined his brother at the kitchen table. Samuel unfolded the letter carefully, revealing Uncle Henry's final message to the nephews he'd never expected to see again. "If you're reading this," the letter began, "then I'm gone and you boys have inherited more than just a farm. You've inherited a responsibility that goes back 3 generations and a secret that people have died to protect." The brothers read in silence, absorbing their uncle's careful explanation of everything they'd discovered and much they hadn't suspected. Uncle Henry had known about Cross long before the mining entrepreneur made his first approach, had documented Cross's pattern of acquiring properties through intimidation and manufactured legal complications. Cross specializes in targeting families who discover mineral wealth on their property, Uncle Henry had written. He uses a network of corrupt officials, intimidation tactics, and fabricated legal problems to force sales at far below market value. I've documented at least 12 properties in Montana and Colorado where he's used these methods successfully. The letter included names, dates, and locations of Cross's previous acquisitions, creating a pattern of criminal behavior that spanned nearly a decade. Uncle Henry had been building a case against Cross, collecting evidence that could expose the entire operation if presented to the right authorities. "The gold deposit beneath our barn is just the beginning," Samuel read aloud. "Our great-grandfather hid additional caches around the property when the bank threatened foreclosure in 1929. I've located 3 separate hiding places, each containing gold that was extracted and refined during the original mining operation." Uncle Henry had drawn a detailed map showing the locations of these hidden treasure caches, marking them with symbols that corresponded to explanations in his journal. The largest cache was hidden in the root cellar beneath the farmhouse, sealed behind a false wall that had protected the gold for nearly a century. "He knew this day would come," Jacob said, studying the map that showed their property as a carefully planned fortress of hidden wealth. Uncle Henry spent years preparing for the moment when Cross would make his move. The letter's final paragraphs contained specific instructions for dealing with Cross's threats, including contact information for federal investigators who had been monitoring Cross's activities. Uncle Henry had established relationships with people who could provide protection and legal support, but only if the brothers proved worthy of the trust he was placing in them. "Cross has connections in local law enforcement," Uncle Henry had written, "but his influence doesn't extend to the federal level. Agent Sarah Martinez, with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, has been investigating Cross for 3 years. She knows about our property and has been waiting for evidence that would allow her to move against Cross directly." Samuel found Agent Martinez's contact information included with the letter, along with a detailed file of documentation that Uncle Henry had compiled about Cross's criminal activities. The evidence was comprehensive enough to support federal charges for racketeering, fraud, and intimidation. "There's more," Jacob said, continuing to read. "Uncle Henry established a trust fund using gold he'd already extracted from the property. The fund contains enough money to support legal challenges to Cross for years, plus additional resources for developing the mining operation safely and responsibly. The trust documents were hidden in a safety deposit box at the bank in town, accessible only to Henry's legitimate heirs with proper identification, and the key that hung on a chain around Uncle Henry's neck when he died. The funeral director had returned the key to the bank, following instructions Uncle Henry had left in his will. He thought of everything, Samuel said, feeling a mixture of admiration and sadness for the uncle they'd barely known, but who had protected them so carefully. Even dying, he was still looking out for us. Jacob folded the letter carefully, understanding that they now possessed the weapons necessary to fight Cross on equal terms. Uncle Henry's careful planning had transformed them from vulnerable targets into opponents capable of bringing down Cross's entire operation. "We're not just protecting our property anymore," Jacob said. "We're finishing something Uncle Henry started. Something that goes back 3 generations of Morrison men who refused to be intimidated by people like Cross." Outside, the Montana evening painted the sky in shades that reminded them of gold, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out a question that sounded like victory. The root cellar beneath the farmhouse had been sealed for decades, its entrance hidden behind stacked preserving jars and cobwebs that suggested abandonment. But Uncle Henry's map led them directly to a section of stone wall that looked solid, but proved to be an elaborate facade concealing a much older storage chamber. Jacob worked carefully with a crowbar, following Uncle Henry's detailed instructions for locating the hidden release mechanism. The false wall swung inward on hinges that had been oiled regularly despite their concealment, revealing a cache that took both brothers' breath away. Their great-grandfather had been thorough in his preparations for the bank's threatened foreclosure. Wooden crates lined the hidden chamber, each one filled with refined gold bars that gleamed in their flashlight beams like captured sunlight. A handwritten inventory dated 1929 documented the contents in their great-grandfather's careful script. 47 bars, approximately 15 pounds each. Total value sufficient for family security. 700 pounds of gold, Samuel calculated, his voice barely above a whisper. At current prices, that's worth over $15 million, but the gold was only part of what their great-grandfather had hidden. Additional crates contained mining equipment wrapped in oiled cloth, surveying instruments that looked like they belonged in a museum, and documents that told the story of the Morrison family's mining heritage in Montana. Among the documents, Jacob found their great-grandfather's original mining claim, filed with the territorial government in 1889 and never legally challenged or superseded. The claim established the Morrison family's legitimate ownership of mineral rights that extended far beyond their current property boundaries. "This changes everything," Jacob said, studying the territorial documents that proved their family had been the first to legally claim the gold deposits in the entire valley. "Cross doesn't just want our property. He wants mineral rights that belong to us by law and precedent." Samuel discovered a collection of weapons wrapped in canvas at the back of the chamber, along with ammunition that had been stored in moisture-proof containers. Their great-grandfather had prepared for the possibility that legal documents might not be sufficient protection against people who wanted to steal what the Morrison family had found. "Uncle Henry added to the collection," Samuel observed, noting more recent additions to the weapons cache. Modern firearms were stored alongside the historical pieces, all of them cleaned and maintained with the same care Uncle Henry had brought to his mining equipment. Wooden box marked "Emergency." Communications contained a sophisticated radio system that could reach law enforcement agencies throughout the region. Uncle Henry had anticipated that local authorities might be compromised or unavailable when Cross made his final move. He was preparing for war, Jacob said, examining the radio equipment and weapons with growing understanding of their uncle's strategic thinking. Not just legal challenges or business negotiations, actual armed conflict. Samuel found Uncle Henry's final additions to the cache, detailed maps of Cross's known properties and operations, photographs of Cross's associates taken with telephoto lenses, and documentation of surveillance techniques that Cross had used against other families. Their uncle had been conducting counterintelligence operations against Cross for years. "Look at this," Samuel said, holding up a thick folder marked Cross-Mining Criminal Evidence. The contents included financial records showing Cross's pattern of acquiring properties through intimidation, testimonies from families who had been forced to sell under duress, and correspondence between Cross and corrupt officials. The evidence was comprehensive enough to support federal charges, but Uncle Henry had never acted on it. A handwritten note explained his reasoning. Evidence must be presented by legitimate property owners who can demonstrate standing to challenge Cross directly. Waiting for Jacob and Samuel to inherit before taking action, Jacob felt the weight of responsibility settling over him like a familiar burden. Uncle Henry hadn't just left them wealth and weapons. He'd left them a mission that required courage, intelligence, and the willingness to risk everything for principles that went beyond personal profit. "There's one more thing," Samuel said, pointing to a steel box secured with a combination lock. Uncle Henry's letter had included the combination, along with a warning that the contents should only be accessed in the most extreme circumstances. Inside the steel box, they found contact information for what Uncle Henry described as allies in necessary places. The list included federal agents, honest law enforcement officials, investigative journalists, and attorneys who specialized in challenging corporate intimidation. Uncle Henry had built a network of support that could be activated when the time came to take down Cross permanently. "We're not alone in this fight," Jacob realized. Studying the extensive list of contacts who had been waiting for the Morrison family to make their move. Uncle Henry spent years building alliances with people who want to see Cross stopped. Samuel closed the steel box carefully, understanding that they now possessed everything necessary to protect their property and destroy Cross's criminal operation. The question was whether they had the courage to use what Uncle Henry had given them. "Tomorrow we start fighting back," Jacob said, his voice carrying the determination of 3 generations of Morrison men who had refused to surrender to intimidation. Cross wanted a war. Now he's going to get one. The harassment began at 3 in the morning with the sound of chainsaws cutting through the Montana darkness. Jacob jerked awake in the farmhouse bedroom, his heart pounding as the mechanical screaming echoed across the property like the cries of mechanical demons. Through the window, he could see headlights moving between the trees that bordered their land, the beams dancing wildly as unseen operators worked to destroy something important. Samuel was already up, standing at the kitchen window with Uncle Henry's emergency radio in his hands. The device crackled with static as he attempted to reach the contacts their uncle had established. But the frequencies were being jammed by sophisticated electronic interference. "They're cutting down the trees along our eastern boundary," Samuel reported, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Blocking our access road and destroying the natural barriers that give us cover from surveillance." Jacob dressed quickly and grabbed one of the firearms from Uncle Henry's cache, checking the ammunition with the practiced efficiency of a man who had grown up hunting in Montana wilderness. Outside, the chainsaw sounds grew closer, accompanied by the rumble of heavy equipment that suggested a coordinated assault on their property. "How many of them?" Jacob asked, joining his brother at the window. "At least 6 vehicles, maybe more. They're staying just outside our property line. Working on land they claim to have purchased from the county for back taxes." Samuel showed Jacob a legal document that had been tacked to their front door, claiming that neighboring properties had been sold to Cross Mining for unpaid assessments. The document was obviously fraudulent, but it provided Cross with legal cover for activities that would otherwise constitute criminal trespassing. His crews could destroy the surrounding landscape while claiming they were developing legally acquired property. "They're boxing us in," Jacob realized, studying the areas marked on Cross's fake legal documents. "If he controls all the surrounding land, he can cut off our access to roads, utilities, everything that makes this property livable." The chainsaw assault continued until dawn, systematically removing the trees that had provided natural privacy and defensive positions around the Morrison property. When the mechanical screaming finally stopped, the brothers emerged to find their land surrounded by clear-cut devastation that looked like a war zone. Cross's crews had been thorough and professional. Every tree within 100 yards of the property line had been felled, creating open ground that would make it impossible for the brothers to move around their land without being observed. The natural beauty that had made their inheritance feel like sanctuary had been transformed into an exposed killing field. "Look at this," Samuel said, pointing to surveying stakes that had been driven into the ground during the night's work. "They're marking boundaries for construction projects. Planning to build something right up against our property line." Jacob examined the stakes, noting that they formed a pattern around their property that would effectively create a fence of industrial development. Cross was preparing to surround their farm with mining operations, processing facilities, and support buildings that would make their life unbearable. A new sound echoed across the devastated landscape, the rumble of heavy trucks approaching from multiple directions. Cross's crews were arriving for the next phase of their intimidation campaign, bringing equipment that looked more suited to military operations than civilian construction. "We need to get word to Agent Martinez," Samuel said, attempting once again to operate Uncle Henry's radio system. "Cross is escalating faster than we expected." The radio remained jammed, but Jacob remembered Uncle Henry's backup communication system. Hidden in the barn was a landline telephone connected to buried cables that ran beneath the property to connection points miles away. Cross's electronic jamming couldn't affect hardwired communications, emergency protocols, Jacob said, recalling Uncle Henry's detailed instructions. "If the radio fails, we use the buried telephone line to contact federal authorities directly." They made their way to the barn under cover of the remaining morning shadows, moving carefully to avoid the surveillance equipment that Cross had undoubtedly positioned around their property. The buried telephone was exactly where Uncle Henry's map indicated, concealed beneath a section of barn floor that looked identical to the surrounding planks. Samuel dialed Agent Martinez's direct number, grateful when the call connected immediately, despite the early hour. FBI agents who specialized in financial crimes apparently kept unusual hours when major cases were breaking. "Agent Martinez, this is Samuel Morrison. Uncle Henry left your contact information. Cross has escalated to direct assault on our property. We need federal intervention immediately." The agent's voice was crisp and professional, carrying the authority of someone who had been waiting for this call. "Mr. Morrison, we've been monitoring Cross's activities through electronic surveillance. Federal agents are already en route to your location. Do not engage Cross's people directly. Help is coming." Outside, the sound of approaching trucks grew louder, accompanied by voices that carried the harsh efficiency of men preparing for violence. Cross's 48-hour deadline had expired, and he was clearly prepared to take the property by force rather than negotiation. "How long until your people arrive?" Samuel asked, watching through a gap in the barn siding as armed men took positions around their property. 20 minutes, Agent Martinez replied. "Stay hidden, stay alive, and let us handle Cross when we arrive." Vincent Cross arrived in person for the final confrontation. Stepping out of his black sedan like a general surveying a battlefield he expected to control. His expensive suit looked out of place among the devastated landscape his crews had created, but his expression carried the cold satisfaction of a man who believed victory was inevitable. Jacob and Samuel watched from the barn, through gaps in the weathered siding, both brothers armed with weapons from Uncle Henry's cache, and positioned to defend their property if negotiations failed. Around them, Cross's men had established a perimeter that suggested military training rather than civilian security work. "Morrison brothers," Cross called out, his voice carrying clearly across the cleared ground. "I believe our 48 hours have expired. Time to discuss the revised terms of our agreement." Samuel checked his watch, noting that Agent Martinez's federal team should arrive within minutes. The challenge was surviving long enough for help to reach them. especially with Cross's men positioned to prevent any escape from the property. "We told you we're not selling," Jacob shouted back, his voice echoing off the barn walls. "Find somewhere else to steal your fortune." Cross's laugh carried no humor, only the cruel amusement of a predator who had cornered his prey. "I'm afraid you've misunderstood the situation, gentlemen. This isn't a negotiation anymore. It's a foreclosure." He gestured to one of his associates, who produced a thick folder of legal documents that looked official enough to fool anyone who didn't examine them closely. Cross had manufactured a complete legal justification for seizing the property, using forged tax assessments and fraudulent liens. According to county records, Cross announced, "This property has accumulated over $200,000 in unpaid taxes and environmental violations. Cross Mining Enterprises has purchased these debts from the county and is here to take possession of the land to satisfy the outstanding obligations." The legal fiction was sophisticated enough to provide cover for what amounted to armed robbery. Cross had created paper documentation that would satisfy any casual investigation, at least long enough for him to establish physical control of the property and its mineral wealth. "You're lying," Samuel called out. "We have Uncle Henry's tax records. Everything was paid current through last year." Uncle Henry, Cross said with mock sympathy, was apparently not as careful with his financial obligations as you believed. Sometimes family members hide their problems until it's too late for help. Cross's men began moving closer to the barn, using the cover of their legal charade to position themselves for assault. Their movements were coordinated and professional, suggesting extensive training in exactly this type of operation. From his position near the barn's rear door, Jacob spotted movement in the tree line beyond Cross's perimeter. Federal agents were arriving exactly as Agent Martinez had promised, taking positions that would allow them to observe the confrontation while remaining hidden from Cross's surveillance. "There's one way to resolve this peacefully," Cross continued, his tone suggesting reasonableness while his men prepared for violence. "Sign the property transfer documents, accept compensation for your cooperation, and walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else." Samuel pulled out Uncle Henry's territorial mining claim, the original document that established the Morrison family's legal ownership of mineral rights throughout the valley. The paper was over a century old, but it represented legal precedent that superseded any modern claims Cross might fabricate. "We have the original territorial mining claim," Samuel announced, holding the document so Cross could see it clearly. "Filed in 1889 and never legally challenged. Our family owns the mineral rights to this entire valley, including the properties you think you've acquired illegally." Cross's expression shifted from predatory confidence to genuine anger as he recognized the implications of the territorial claim. If the Morrison brothers could prove legitimate ownership of valley-wide mineral rights, Cross's entire operation would be exposed as criminal fraud. "That document has no legal standing," Cross snarled, his careful facade finally cracking. "Territorial claims were superseded by statehood legislation decades ago. Federal law says otherwise," Samuel replied, remembering Uncle Henry's careful research into mining legislation. "Territorial claims that were properly filed and maintained retain precedence over subsequent state and county regulations." The sound of approaching vehicles echoed from multiple directions as federal agents moved to surround Cross's position. Agent Martinez's team had arrived with enough force to handle armed resistance, their black SUVs appearing through the devastated tree line like cavalry arriving at the last possible moment. Cross realized he was trapped between the Morrison brothers' defensive position and the federal agents closing in from behind. His carefully planned assault had become a disaster that would expose his entire criminal operation to federal investigation. "This isn't over," Cross warned, his voice carrying the venom of a man who had built his fortune on intimidation and found himself facing opponents he couldn't frighten. "I have resources and connections you can't imagine." "So did we," Jacob replied, watching federal agents take positions around Cross's men. Uncle Henry made sure of that. Agent Sarah Martinez emerged from the tree line with the calm authority of someone who had been building this case for years. Her FBI team moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding Cross's men and establishing control of the situation before anyone could consider resistance. The federal badges gleaming in the morning sunlight carried more weight than Cross's manufactured legal documents. "Vincent Cross," Agent Martinez announced, her voice carrying across the cleared ground with unmistakable finality. "You're under arrest for racketeering, fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy to commit theft of mineral rights. Your operation ends here." Cross's men surrendered their weapons without resistance, recognizing federal authority when they saw it. Most of them were hired muscle rather than committed criminals, more interested in steady paychecks than facing federal prison sentences for their employers' schemes. Jacob and Samuel emerged from the barn, still carrying Uncle Henry's weapons, but no longer needing them for protection. The confrontation they'd been dreading had ended not with violence, but with the patient work of federal investigators who had been building their case methodically. "Mr. Morrison," Agent Martinez said, approaching the brothers with evidence bags already prepared for the documents they carried. "Your uncle's cooperation was invaluable to our investigation. His documentation of Cross's criminal activities provided the foundation for everything we've accomplished today." Samuel handed over Uncle Henry's files willingly, understanding that federal prosecution would accomplish more than private revenge. Cross's entire network of corrupt officials and intimidation tactics would be exposed through proper legal channels. "How long have you been watching Cross?" Jacob asked, noting the professional efficiency of the federal team's operation. 3 years of active investigation," Agent Martinez replied. "Cross has used these tactics to steal mineral rights from at least 15 families across Montana and Colorado. Your uncle was the first person willing to document the pattern and provide evidence for federal prosecution." Cross stood handcuffed beside his sedan, his expensive suit rumpled and his expression showing the first signs of genuine fear he'd displayed since arriving at the property. The legal documents he'd used to justify his assault were being photographed as evidence of forgery and fraud. "The territorial mining claim your family holds is legally valid," Agent Martinez continued, examining the 1889 document with obvious respect. "Federal law protects legitimate territorial claims from state and local interference. Cross's attempts to acquire your mineral rights through intimidation constitute federal crimes." The brothers watched as FBI agents systematically arrested Cross's associates, documenting weapons, forged legal papers, and electronic surveillance equipment that would support multiple federal charges. Uncle Henry's patient documentation had provided the framework for dismantling an entire criminal enterprise. "What happens to our property?" Samuel asked, concerned about the legal complications Cross had created. "All of Cross's claims against your property are invalid," Agent Martinez explained. "The forged tax liens, environmental violations, and county sales are federal evidence now. Your ownership is clear and protected by federal law." Jacob looked across the devastated landscape where Cross's crews had destroyed decades of natural growth in a single night. The environmental damage would take years to repair, but the criminal threat to their family's legacy had been eliminated permanently. "Cross will face federal charges in multiple states," Agent Martinez continued. "His network of corrupt officials is being arrested simultaneously across the region. This operation ends his ability to threaten rural families anywhere." Samuel felt the weight of 3 generations of Morrison family responsibility lifting from his shoulders. Uncle Henry's careful planning had protected not just their property, but countless other families who might have faced Cross's intimidation in the future. "There's something else," Agent Martinez said, pulling out additional documents from her briefcase. "Your territorial mining claim establishes precedent for other families Cross has victimized. Federal law allows recovery of properties stolen through fraudulent means. The implications were staggering. Cross's entire criminal empire would be dismantled, with stolen properties returned to their legitimate owners and criminal proceeds seized for victim compensation. Uncle Henry's courage in documenting Cross's crimes had protected far more than just the Morrison family farm. Your uncle left detailed instructions for developing your mineral resources, legally and responsibly, Agent Martinez added. Federal mining permits can be expedited for legitimate claims like yours, especially when the applicants have cooperated with federal investigations. Jacob and Samuel looked at each other across the farmyard that had been transformed from battlefield to crime scene, both understanding that their inheritance included more than just gold and land. Uncle Henry had left them the tools to build something that would honor their family's century-long struggle to protect their Montana heritage. Cross wanted to steal our legacy, Jacob said, watching federal agents load evidence into their vehicles. Instead, he's going to help us protect it for the next generation. Agent Martinez smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had spent years building a case that would deliver justice for victims across multiple states. That's exactly what your uncle hoped would happen when he started documenting Cross's crimes. 6 months after Cross's arrest, the first legitimate gold sale from the Morrison property generated enough revenue to transform not just the brothers' lives, but the economic future of their entire valley. Jacob signed the bank deposit slip with hands that still showed calluses from months of careful mining work, but his signature now carried the weight of financial security their family had never known. The check represented 47 ounces of refined gold, extracted using proper mining techniques and sold through legitimate channels that Agent Martinez had helped them establish. At current market prices, the sale generated over $90,000 in revenue, with extraction costs minimal thanks to Uncle Henry's careful preparation of the mining infrastructure. First of many, Samuel said, examining the bank statement that showed their account balance had increased by more than either brother had earned in their previous combined annual income. Conservative estimates suggest we can maintain this level of production for at least 15 years. The brothers had invested in proper mining equipment and safety protocols, working with geological consultants who confirmed that the Morrison family gold deposit was among the richest undeveloped claims in Montana. Uncle Henry's careful excavation had exposed only a fraction of the actual mineral wealth hidden beneath their property. Thomas Kellerman, Martha's son who had returned from Colorado with professional mining experience, supervised the extraction operation with the expertise Uncle Henry had hoped to find among trusted neighbors. The work proceeded carefully and safely, with environmental protections that exceeded federal requirements. Your uncle would be proud, Thomas said, watching Jacob operate the small-scale refining equipment they'd installed in a converted section of the barn. He always believed this deposit should be developed by family members who understood the responsibility that comes with this kind of wealth. The brothers had established the Henry Morrison Foundation exactly as their uncle had envisioned, using gold revenues to provide legal protection and financial assistance to rural families facing pressure from extractive industries. Cross's arrest had exposed similar criminal operations throughout the region, creating demand for the kind of support the foundation could provide. Martha served as the foundation's first president, bringing decades of community leadership experience to the organization Uncle Henry had planned but never lived to see established. Her kitchen table became the foundation's first headquarters, where families could seek help without the intimidation factor of formal legal offices. We've had 12 families contact us this month, Martha reported during their weekly foundation meeting. Mining companies, development firms, even some agricultural corporations are using pressure tactics similar to what Cross tried. Here, the foundation's legal fund had grown substantial, enough to challenge corporate intimidation campaigns in federal court. While the brothers' mining operation provided steady revenue to support families who couldn't afford to fight alone, Uncle Henry's vision of protecting rural heritage was becoming reality through the wealth he'd helped preserve. Samuel had married his longtime girlfriend Rebecca that spring, using gold revenues to purchase the ring he'd never been able to afford during their years of financial struggle. The wedding took place in the farmhouse where Uncle Henry's careful planning had made their new life possible. Jacob used his share of the mining revenues to expand the operation responsibly, purchasing additional equipment that would allow sustainable extraction while minimizing environmental impact. The Montana wilderness that surrounded their property remained pristine, protected by the economic security that proper resource development could provide. "Look at this," Samuel said, showing Jacob a letter from Agent Martinez with updates on Cross's federal prosecution. Cross pled guilty to 17 federal charges. He's facing 25 years in federal prison, and his entire criminal organization has been dismantled. The letter included information about asset recovery proceedings that would return stolen properties to their legitimate owners across multiple states. Cross's network of corrupt officials had been exposed and prosecuted, eliminating the infrastructure that had made his intimidation campaigns possible. Properties that Cross had acquired through fraud were being returned to the families he'd victimized, while his legitimate business assets were being liquidated to provide victim compensation. The Morrison brothers' cooperation with federal investigators had helped deliver justice for dozens of families who had been too frightened or too poor to fight Cross alone. The foundation received a federal grant, Martha announced during their next meeting, $200,000 to expand legal assistance programs for rural families facing corporate pressure. "We're becoming a model for protecting agricultural communities throughout the Mountain West." Jacob looked out the farmhouse window toward the barn, where their mining operation hummed quietly with the sound of sustainable prosperity. The Montana landscape stretched beyond their property in all directions, no longer threatening but welcoming. Protected by the economic security Uncle Henry's careful planning had made possible. Their bank account statement showed steady growth from gold sales, foundation activities, and investment returns that would support the Morrison family for generations to come. Uncle Henry's faith in their ability to handle inherited responsibility had been proven correct through months of careful stewardship. 1 year after inheriting the deserted farm, Jacob and Samuel Morrison stood before a gleaming wooden sign that marked the entrance to their property with words that would have made Uncle Henry proud. Morrison Mining Company, established 1889, restored 2025, a family legacy protected. The sign represented more than just business identification. It symbolized 3 generations of Morrison determination, the courage to fight for what belonged to them, and the wisdom to understand that true wealth comes from protecting something valuable for those who follow. The farmhouse had been restored to its original dignity, with fresh paint and modern conveniences that made it comfortable without destroying its historical character. The front porch no longer sagged, and the windows gleamed with glass that let in Montana sunlight without the filter of decades of neglect. Behind the house, the barn stood as both monument and workplace, its red paint renewed, but its weathered wood left unchanged to honor the building's long service to the Morrison family. Inside, the mining operation hummed with quiet efficiency, extracting gold at a sustainable pace that would support the family for generations while protecting the environment that surrounded their property. "Dad would have been amazed," Samuel said, looking across the restored property toward the mountains that form the horizon of their Montana world. From broke and desperate to financially secure in less than a year, Uncle Henry's planning made all the difference. Jacob nodded, remembering the morning they'd first arrived at what everyone else considered worthless land. Their pickup truck had been running on hope and determination. and their bank account had been measured in double digits rather than the substantial balance that now supported their expanding operations. The Morrison Mining Company employed 12 local workers, providing steady jobs in a rural economy that had struggled with the departure of traditional industries. Thomas Kellerman supervised daily operations with the expertise Uncle Henry had hoped to find among trusted neighbors. While the brothers focused on strategic planning and community engagement, the Henry Morrison Foundation occupied a restored building in town, offering legal assistance and financial support to rural families facing pressure from extractive industries. Martha continued as president, but the organization had grown large enough to employ professional staff who could provide services Uncle Henry had only dreamed of offering. Foundation helped another family this week, Samuel reported. Reading from Martha's latest update, development company tried to force a sale using environmental violations that turned out to be fabricated. Our legal team stopped them before they could escalate to intimidation. The foundation's success had attracted national attention, earning federal grants and private donations that expanded its ability to protect rural communities throughout the Mountain West. Uncle Henry's vision of turning their family's gold into protection for other families had exceeded even his most optimistic projections. Agent Martinez visited regularly, bringing updates on prosecutions that had grown from their original case against Cross. The FBI's investigation had expanded to cover corporate intimidation campaigns in 12 states, with the Morrison brothers' cooperation serving as the foundation for a broader federal initiative to protect family property rights. Cross's conviction inspired other families to come forward. Agent Martinez explained during her most recent visit, "Your uncle's documentation techniques are being used to train other victims in proper evidence collection. The Morrison case has become a model for federal prosecution of corporate intimidation." Rebecca Morrison, Samuel's wife of 6 months, had transformed the farmhouse kitchen into the heart of a home that welcomed neighbors and business partners with equal warmth. Her cooking attracted visitors who came for foundation meetings and stayed for conversations that strengthened the community bonds Uncle Henry had valued. Jacob had begun dating Elena Vasquez's daughter Maria, a relationship that promised to continue the Morrison family's commitment to their Montana community. Their courtship progressed with the patient certainty of people who understood that the best things in life were worth waiting for and working toward. The mining operations' annual revenue had reached sustainable levels that supported both family needs and foundation activities without depleting the gold deposits Uncle Henry had spent years mapping and protecting. Conservative extraction practices ensured that future generations of Morrisons would inherit wealth along with responsibility. "What do you think Uncle Henry would say about all this?" Jacob asked, watching sunset paint the Montana sky in shades that reminded him of the gold veins running through the cave beneath their barn. Samuel considered the question while examining the latest geological reports that confirmed extensive gold deposits extending far beyond what they'd originally discovered. Uncle Henry's careful exploration had revealed only the beginning of their family's mineral wealth. "I think he'd say we proved worthy of the trust he placed in us," Samuel replied. "We took what he gave us and used it to protect something larger than ourselves." The brothers stood in their farmyard as evening settled over the Montana landscape, both understanding that they had inherited more than gold and land. They had inherited the responsibility to protect and preserve something valuable for future generations, and they had proven equal to that challenge through courage, wisdom, and the patient work of building something lasting. Uncle Henry's legacy lived on in every ounce of gold they extracted responsibly, every family the foundation protected, and every day they chose to be the men he had believed they could become.